and a kind of will for change, almost as if people are saying, this is intolerable. We've allowed it to go on for too long. When I'm in Porto Alegre at the World Social Forum, or I'm in Lusaka at the African Social Forum, or meeting in Mpumalanga and Soweto, the ghettos of South Africa, there's such an impatience, particularly among young people, saying the world must change. There really ought to be a greater emphasis on humane values. This nonsense about hanging around in the shopping malls, you know, and competing for Nike or whatever. This is nonsense. We have to get over it. Humanity is about more than material things. And we really must shake off this kind of almost mystification, the way we've been caught up in a set of lies and deceptions, and we try and recover our own humanity. So I'm very hopeful.
South African poet and anti-apartheid and global justice activist Dennis Brutus. He died of prostate cancer in Cape Town, South Africa on Saturday. We did that interview in 2005. Well, for more on the life and legacy of the great South African poet and activist, I'm joined now from San Francisco by Patrick Bond. Patrick directs the Center for Civil Society at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, where Dennis Brutus worked. Patrick, welcome to Democracy Now! As you listen to Dennis Brutus, and of course, as you spent the years with him that you did, talk more about his significance, this man who crushed rocks side by side with Nelson Mandela on Robben Island.
Thanks, Amy. Great to be with you. And I think the role that Dennis Brutus played, especially upon returning to South Africa after democracy in 1994 and living there full-time for the last 5 years, a really formidable, inspiring role for a new generation of people concerned about inequality and environmental degradation. His last campaigns, for example, against the Copenhagen deal, the very inadequate and unfair relationships of north to south around the climate debt. And, you know, even in his last days, he'd just been meeting with the Archbishop, former Archbishop of Cape Town, Njongonkulu Ndingani, about the reparations movement. So he had this amazing ability to look backward, and he was fighting the big corporations that profited from apartheid, hoping that the process now going through the courts in the United States will become a very, very important marker for corporations to learn not to profit from a crime against humanity, but at the same time looking forward and saying to the North and to indeed the South African government that the greenhouse gas emissions have to halt. So this extraordinary ability to do the whole spectrum of social struggles, history and future, and to do it with such grace, eloquence and culture.
I wanted to go actually to a clip on his 85th birthday. It was just a few weeks ago. This is a clip of Dennis Brutus calling for the Seattling of Copenhagen because climate debt is not on the agenda. He was talking about the climate summit and the protests that he expected. This was just before the Copenhagen climate summit.
From now on, this is going to be part of our challenge, our part of the challenge to the greedy corporate powers that don't care what happens to the planet. So we expect them to pay attention. We hope that we ourselves will pay attention, and then, most difficult of all, we are going to have to join that struggle, but not enough time. We are in serious difficulty all over the planet. We are going to say to the world, there's too much of profit, too much of greed, too much of suffering by the poor. It must have to stop. The planet must be in action. The people of the planet must be in action.
Dennis Brutus on his 85th birthday. He was in Cape Town, South Africa. He died this weekend. His family around him died in his sleep. He died of prostate cancer. Patrick Bond, talk about his political history. After he was imprisoned with Nelson Mandela, he was banned from teaching and writing and publishing in South Africa. His first book of poetry, Sirens, Knuckles and Boots, actually published in Nigeria. And it was then that Dennis Brutus fled South Africa and came to the United States, ultimately applying for political asylum, a case he finally won, and then ended up teaching here.
That's right. He actually had a stop in Britain along the way. He worked in the ANC office and was a bastion of the sports boycotts movement. He was extraordinarily successful. As mentioned earlier, he was basically single-handedly responsible for pulling a coalition together that forced the Chicago leader of the Olympics, Avery Brundage, to make a U-turn and kick the white South African team off the 1968 Mexico Olympics, and then in 1970 had them banned. So those were markers of an exceptional campaigner, a very persuasive advocate of racial justice. And I think at that point, when he also turned his hand to professional literary studies and became the chair of African American studies both at Northwestern and at University of Pittsburgh, retiring in 1995, he then brought all of these capacities, intellectual, strategic, and very, very inspiring capacities to the South Africa struggle in 1996 with the growth, employment redistribution, homegrown structural adjustment, coming back to South Africa, starting the Jubilee movement. He really put an extraordinary marker on post-apartheid struggles for economic justice and later environment. And then he was a central figure in Seattle of the World Social Forum in the early 2000s. In fact, really, Amy, as you know from being there at every G8 and World Bank, IMF annual meeting, WTO protest, you'd find Dennis Brutus out both in the crowd in a very humble way, listening and learning, and often on the speaker's stand, providing inspiration.
The way his politics continued to evolve, and also critiquing the ANC, the group he was closely affiliated with so many years against apartheid in South Africa, Patrick.
Yeah, I think in around about 98, when the Treatment Action Campaign started demanding AIDS medicines, in 1999, when a number of the communities in the big urban areas began to revolt, and we now have about 10,000 protests a year that the police measure, about the highest rate per person in the world. And that really signaled to Dennis Brutus that he was a very welcome struggles that were timeless, and his own principles and commitment and his generosity of spirit, and again these extraordinary poems that kept popping out. Working with us in Durban at the University of KwaZulu-Natal over the past 4 years, we were always amazed that whatever the circumstances, Dennis would have a new poem ready. He wrote several this year that are classics. Probably his best really were the poems of incarceration, as you mentioned, Sirens, Knuckles, Boots, Letters to Martha. Those will still stand decades from now as seminal works that, especially here in the United States with such a high incarceration rate, really focus the word and the spirit of liberation in a form that broke out of the traditions and spoke to ever expanding generations of fans and people who've had one-on-one contact with him. We're hearing from them from all over the world, and life-changing experiences to be touched by Dennis Brutus, and to have a sort of sense of his combination of bread and roses.
Patrick Bond, we will leave it there, professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, close friend and former colleague of Dennis Brutus. Dennis Brutus is survived by his wife, May, his sisters, Helen and Dolly, 8 children, 9 grandchildren, 4 great-grandchildren in Hong Kong, England, U.S., and Cape Town. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Berkshire, for the producer, Armata Angelica, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.